club upside your head and then turn around and accuse you of attacking them.
I am the people. I'm not the pig. You got to make a distinction. And the people are going to have to attack the pigs. The people are going to have to stand up against the pigs. That's what the pastors are doing. That's what the pastors do all over.
Your pants is a concert. Profit. I get it. Everybody know I'm a monster. I'ma need to see your hands at the concert. I'ma need to see your hands.
Everybody has a lot of opinions about what monsters really are, who they are, what they represent, who gets to decide. And Mary Shelley's gothic horror novel Frankenstein has an answer to those questions. One that both exposes and inadvertently reinforces the dehumanizing logic at the heart of American racism. Though the novel never explicitly names race, it repeatedly invokes the language of enslavement and mastery, and reading it as a racial allegory reveals both the novel's sharp critique of systemic oppression and the dangerous limits of the metaphor itself. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818 at the age of 19, influenced by the Romantic and Enlightenment movements prominent at the time. The story follows Victor Frankenstein, a young scientist who creates a sentient creature from disparate body parts, sending both of them on a tragic crash course that ends up impacting Victor's friends, family, and eventually himself. In the years since its inception, Frankenstein has gone on to become a cultural touchstone, evolving into a line of movies, television series, short films, and more, becoming the unrivaled monster story for American culture. But when discussing Frankenstein's legacy, there's one aspect that goes overlooked: its commentary on race. For some reason, the Black community has latched onto the story of Frankenstein, often redefining and reimagining its imagery throughout the years as explicitly Black. But what does the original text of Frankenstein have to say about race? How does it expose the deep-seated flaws in the nature of the allegory? And how does it connect to the real-life history of Black Americans? Well, let's find out, because this is a
gossip, you can just stop it. Everybody know I'm a monster. I'ma need to see your hands at the concert. I'ma need to see your hands at the concert.
Dr. Stein would like to see you in his laboratory.
Poorly conceived blaxploitation ripoffs aside, Frankenstein's creation doesn't explicitly define him as a Black person. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion, and straight black lips. Although some argue that these features are, quote, commonly encountered in colonial depictions of Asian, Indian, and African savages, this description seems to pretty clearly classify Frankenstein as not Black. So why is it that since his inception he's been widely accepted as a racial allegory? In real life, Mary Shelley and her husband Percy were well aware of the rampant institution of slavery at the time, with Percy publishing Queen Mab in 1812, a poem openly critical of the system of slavery and imperialism. Britain had abolished the slave trade in 1807, but slavery still existed in British colonies and would not go on to be fully abolished until the 1830s. Shelley's desire to engage with the racial politics of her time can be seen in Frankenstein, as there are several explicit references to slavery and race. Beyond these quotes, it's easy for Black viewers to sympathize with Frankenstein, especially when viewing him as an allegory for a runaway slave. He is denied a formal education, he often calls Victor his master, and Victor pursuing the creature across the Arctic is reminiscent of how a slave master would hunt a runaway. Even the creature asking Victor for a wife mirrors how slaves were often forbidden to be married, or how their wives and children were sold, denying them any sense of fidelity or sustained monogamy. The metaphor is clear. Within 15 years of Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, rebellions like Nat Turner's Revolt all exacerbated white fears of what would happen if slaves were emancipated. Even Victor's reaction to Frankenstein asking for a bride, fearing that they would repopulate and return for retribution, reflected the real-life sentiments of slave owners who were against abolishing slavery. They feared facing any kind of consequences for the horrors of slavery, so a story about a creation violently rebelling against its master only further validated these worries. But the most troubling of the connections between the creature and a runaway slave is the creature's dynamic with white women. When the creature saves the little girl from drowning in the river, he is shot by her father, assuming she is being attacked. When he kills William, he finds a medallion of his mother and appears to be attracted to her. Later, the creature kills Elizabeth, Victor's fiancée and the emblem of a pure white woman for much of the book. These descriptions play into dominant cultural anxieties further seen in post-Reconstruction era media like Birth of a Nation, a movie that, despite its outright racist message about black men's inherent threat to white women, was the first film to ever be played in the White House. It's an image that has persisted through the years and resurfaced in some unsettling ways. The message is clear. This is who black people, specifically black men, are. A threat. Monsters. In 1931, the first Frankenstein film was released in theaters. That same year, 9 African-American teenagers known as the Scottsboro Boys were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a freight train in Alabama. After years of trials, legal battles, and appeals, the charges were dropped in 1937. 2 years earlier, in the sequel to Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, the creature is strung up on a tree as a white mob surrounds him, accusing him of violating a white girl. This imagery feels familiar. 20 years later, in 1955, a young African-American teenage boy was abducted and lynched in Mississippi after being accused of harassing a white woman. That boy's name was Emmett Till. He was kidnapped, tortured, shot, and thrown into the river. On her deathbed, Till's accuser confessed to lying on the stand. The Central Park 5, the Groveland 4, the Duluth lynchings. The same story, again and again. Time and time again, black people fall victim to the assumptions of whites stemmed in racial biases. Think about how civil rights activists were and have been demonized in media simply for refusing to accept things as they were. Their logic has holes, but it's effective. Who would do such a thing? Who would commit such heinous acts? Especially this. Rape? Murder? Assault? I mean, just look at black on black crime. It must just be who they are. It must be in their nature. It must be because they're monsters. The flaw of viewing Frankenstein as a racial allegory is obvious. It critiques racial power structures and prejudice while simultaneously reinforcing the dehumanization of black Americans. When people in the book see Frankenstein, they have an immediate negative reaction because his body is made out of discarded limbs from graves. He's basically a reanimated corpse with superhuman strength. Of course they were scared. But black people are not 6 feet tall, superhuman monsters made out of dead bodies. We have brown skin. That is it, and that is all. Saying that Frankenstein is black gives some kind of validity to real, harmful eugenic arguments that continue to justify racism and prejudice. There is nothing reasonable about racism. To view Frankenstein as a metaphor for blackness ultimately makes no sense because it makes that racism seem somewhat reasonable, especially as Frankenstein goes on to commit acts like murder. It lets prejudiced people off the hook for their views by making them seem like self-preservation. The only kind of validity that this allegory provides is in the creature's perspective. When he was created, he was pure, kind, curious, but everyone assumed the worst of him anyway. Everyone saw him as a monster anyway. That's an accurate depiction of the treatment black Americans face every day. They are beaten down by the world on a daily basis. It doesn't matter if they're monsters because that's what people assume anyway. If the world tells you you're a monster and gives you no resources or the benefit of the doubt to become anything more, it makes sense that you would become one. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. And and to put the responsibility of this decision on the one individual, expecting them to be so morally sound and benevolent that they single-handedly become the exception to the rule, instead of putting the blame on a corrupt system that continues to oppress them every day, is naive. Especially when you consider that this often doesn't protect people the way we're supposed to believe it does. There's a belief among many Black Americans that all we need to do to overcome racism is be good enough, moral enough, successful enough, obtain enough accolades, and we can prove that we're just as human as them. But a society that has decided that your humanity is conditional is one that has decided that your humanity is disposable. Believing that didn't protect any of these people, because of course it didn't. Because it was never about following rules, doing things the right way, working hard, or complying with orders. It didn't matter whether they were monsters, because they were never given the luxury of being human first. To compare this to the creature, a real-life monster, is obscene. But the truth isn't that Frankenstein doesn't resemble these stories. It's that these stories resemble Frankenstein, a society terrified of the life it created, desperate to call it a monster instead of facing what it's done. Here's another interesting way I've seen Frankenstein described. Victor creates life, rejects it, and spends the rest of the book fleeing from the consequences. Victor can be read as America itself, and the creature can represent Black Americans. The creature was not created on accident, and Black Americans were not brought to America on accident. The system of chattel slavery forcefully brought enslaved Africans to America. Victor and America both unquestionably benefited from their creation, but the minute they were emancipated, they rejected them. Black codes, Jim Crow, the KKK, hundreds of years of systemic exclusion and oppression, leading to violence, fear, and terror befalling the creation, Black Americans. In the years since Frankenstein's release, it has been widely accepted that the real creature, the real demon, the real monster was Victor. Look at history. Look at the actions committed by white Americans towards Blacks. It's always asked, who would do such a thing? And time again, the answer is always Black people. Never once has the question been turned on its head. In a 2020 report, it was discovered that there were 6,500 lynchings between 1877 and 1950. Families would show up with picnics to watch. Purses were made out of the skin of Black bodies as souvenirs. Black people were often cannibalized by white and European colonizers. Who would do such a thing? Who would commit such heinous acts? Who would be so cruel at every turn? It must just be who they are. It must be in their nature. It must be because we're not the real monsters. It must be you.
I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. I base this on their conduct, not on what they say. And this means that they have become, in themselves, moral monsters.